Before we start this video on social and cultural identities, I want to let you know that this video is a tiny bit longer than the ones you're used to for this class. So if you need to take a break in the middle, please feel free to do so. Before I talk too much about the different social and cultural identities that you might hold as an individual, I want to make sure that we know a few things about identity in general. First, it's important to remember that we have many different identities and not a singular identity. So we pick and choose which identities are important to us in given situations. We might choose to display an identity that seems most appropriate to us in a given context, or we might choose to hide that identity and rather we display an identity that's culturally sanctioned in that same context. So sometimes we'll make decisions about which identity we display based upon our own personal preferences or based upon what's culturally sanctioned. No matter how we pick which identity we want to display, it's important to remember that, like Superman, we all do have more than one identity that we can choose to display in a given situation. As I just said, society dictates to a degree what identity displays are acceptable in what contexts. So today, women are empowered to be both moms and workers in the public sphere. Because of this newfound freedom, society dictates that women ought to be good organizational members, good mothers. They should have clean homes, they should cook healthy meals, they should have happy families, they should work out so that they can maintain a perfect body, and the list goes on and on and on. So as much as we sometimes think that we're selecting our identity, societal powers and societal structures do help us to determine which identities are appropriate for us to display in given situations. So I'm sure some of you don't want to have kids someday, but are you likely to tell people this? Most of the time people will say no, because a lot of times people don't understand why individuals would purposefully choose not to have children. So society isn't very accepting of an identity that doesn't want to be a parent. So if you happen to own that particular identity, you might not choose to display that identity in a lot of contexts. The last important thing to remember is that identities are negotiated through our communication or through our talk. So when we talk to people, they either confirm or disconfirm the identities we have chosen to display. And because of this, the other people are tied to our identity development processes. So we learn who we are and we learn who we ought to be by examining which identities we're rewarded for displaying and which identities we're punished for displaying in particular contexts. So we see that our identities are tied to the cultures that we're part of, because certain cultures will be more accepting of particular identities than other cultures are. And then those identities are further developed and refined through our communication with individuals in those cultures. So what are some of the important social and cultural identities for us to consider? First, we have to consider gender identity, and it's connected to the degree of masculinity and or femininity that we display in particular situations. So many times people think that gender is biologically determined. That it isn't. So when we look to biology, we're talking about sex. People are male or female largely based on their sex organs and their chromosomal makeup. There can be variations in the sex that you display other than male or female, but for simplicity's sake, we'll refer to just those two biological groupings when we talk about sex. While everything that the graphic on the screen says about gender is correct, we aren't always free to display the gender identity that we'd like to. And this is because societal pressures and norms that dictate for us what it means to be a good man and a good woman. So what are some of those gendered norms that we have to compete with? First, societal expectations for masculinity indicate that men shouldn't be feminine. So we tell little boys not to cry and not to be emotional. We don't let little boys play with dolls. We have statements like you run like a girl or you throw like a girl, which indicate that being a girl is a flawed identity. Men are rewarded when they're not feminine, so breadwinning fathers are thought of more highly than stay-at-home dads. Good fathers are prized no matter what, but the best dads are going to be the ones who earn a living and provide good care for their kids. Next, men are expected to be successful. Especially within our individualized culture, male worth is measured by how successful that man is. So does he provide for his family? Does he have an attractive wife? Does he have attractive children? Does he own his own home? Does he drive a nice car? Again, the metric for success is culturally determined. So I have a friend who feels unsuccessful at times because his wife has to work. Now, the vast majority of homes in our country are dual earner, so both the husband and wife do have to work in the vast majority of households with young children. Nonetheless, he feels as if he's not necessarily successful as a man because he hasn't been able to provide for his wife and his child in a way that would enable his wife to not work. Again, men experience these pressures to be successful. Men are also expected to be aggressive, so boys fight, and this is completely acceptable behavior for young boys. Boys can play football, boys can play hockey, where it's readily accepted that people might throw their hockey sticks down and begin punching one another for no apparent reason. So what are some ways that you can think of that male aggression is rewarded in today's society? Men are also expected to be sexual. So we sometimes comment on the fact that men can sleep with lots of women and not be considered sluts, whereas a woman who sleeps with lots of men is considered a slut. And this is because society prizes male sexuality and female chastity. This is difficult to accomplish if you think about it, but it's a cultural expectation nonetheless. We can see this expectation most recently if we look at the shootings that happened in California this past May. So there was a young man who shot a bunch of individuals outside of the University of California, Santa Barbara campus because he had indicated that he wanted to shoot and kill all of the women who had rejected him. So he was in college and he was still a virgin and he was upset about this. And he was upset about all of the women who rejected him and then went on to sleep with what he considered to be lesser males. So there's this expectation in our society that men should have lots of sex when they're young. So his inability to get girls to sleep with him was, to him at least, an attack on his masculinity. So these young women weren't enabling him to confirm that masculine identity that he felt. So he responded by reaffirming his masculinity through an overtly aggressive act. Men are also expected to be self-sufficient. So this ties into individualism as well. Men are expected not to need emotional support, financial support, or really any advice from other people. They're expected to know how to fix any problem that they might encounter. So if you think about the Boy Scouts, right? These young men are taught to be self-sufficient and to always be prepared for anything that could happen in their lives. So from a very young age, men are taught the need to be self-reliant. Finally, men are expected to both embody and transcend masculinity. So they have to be all of the things I just suggested, while they also have to accept that those things are problematic ways to describe masculinity. And therefore they need to be both aggressive and caring. They need to be caring, which is feminine, but also not feminine. So they need to be successful at work and successful at home. They need to be sexual and respectful of women. So this is the tricky one for guys. So to be a good man today, you have to be a stereotypical man and also accept that there's lots of reasons why being a stereotypical man isn't good. Right, so now that we've learned the norms for men, what about for women? So what does our culture value concerning femininity? For those who embrace a feminine identity, they'll likely recognize the feminine norm that appearance matters or appearance still counts. Think of all the makeup, hair, diet, and clothing advertisements you see. The products marketed to women are all those that will make them more attractive. So women are shunned if they leave the house without makeup on, or if they leave the house in their yoga pants, that's a signal that they've given up, right? So for the ladies, we recognize that how we look is very important to society. Women are also expected to be sensitive and caring. So they're expected to freely give of their time to listen to their friends when they have problems, to help out individuals who need help. And this can be problematic because a lot of times caring jobs are gendered feminine, and thus they're lower paid jobs and they're less respected jobs. So being a nurse is about providing care and support to those who are ill. This job is thought of as a woman's job, and many times when men are in the field, they're teased about it. So if you think of Greg in Meet the Parents, his masculinity is questioned because he's a nurse. He has this feminine job. So again, it's a subtle reminder that men are not supposed to be feminine. Women are also taught to expect negative treatment by others. So women are told how not to be raped, right? They're told how not to be discriminated against at work. They're told how not to be passed over for a promotion. So instead of teaching women how to achieve great things, We teach them how to avoid bad things from happening to them, and this enables women to expect that bad things will happen to them. Going back to an image we've already seen, women are also expected to be superwomen, so they're expected to have it all. So truly this concept isn't possible to attain, yet women are taught that they need to be successful at work and successful at home if they're going to be considered successful women. So they're seldom taught to define success by finding a meaningful balance in their life. Rather, they're told that they can have it all, and because they can have it all, they ought to have it all. So this leads women to incur a lot of stress in their lives as they try and be great at everything. Finally, women, just like men, are expected to rise above traditional notions of femininity, and they're expected to embrace and recognize that there are many different ways to be feminine. So again, this is problematic for the women because to be a good woman, you have to both do what society expects you to do and also rise above it. Another social and cultural identity we hold concerns our sexual identity. So even though U.S. American culture is more accepting of gay and lesbian lifestyles, a heterosexual identity is still the privileged identity in our culture. So other than marriage equality, in what ways does society privilege heterosexual identities? Growing up, my mom always asked me to act my age and not my shoe size. And that's because society has expectations for how we ought to behave given our age. For example, I'm over 30 now, and it's inconceivable to my mother that my husband and I don't have kids. It didn't matter that we both were working on PhDs and wanted to finish school. When you get close to 30, you ought to be settled down and you ought to be starting a family. The push for children in my family, at least, is so significant that even though I've told my mother when my husband and I plan on having kids, I still get asked about it every time I talk to her. So again, it's not acceptable to not act your age. It's not acceptable to be over 30 and not have children. What does society think that those in their late teens and early 20s ought to be doing? At what age do you think that those expectations for you will start to change? We can also have racial identities, and these are based on both physical characteristics of a person and the societal expectations for that person. So while we might want to think that there are a lot of differences between the races, science has revealed to us that people are actually more similar than different when it comes to race. So there's more variability within a race than there is between races. So what this reminds us is that although we might look different, we're actually more similar and we're actually closer to a single human race than we are to different races because we have different outward appearances. Racial identities are different than ethnic identities, which are linked to the ethnic groups with which we associate. So your ethnic identity would link you to people from a particular place through shared traditions, shared customs, values, and behaviors. So typically you'd think of your ethnic identity as a feeling of connectedness to people in a particular location. So for example, my family's Polish, and for my grandparents especially, being Polish was something that they placed a lot of pride in. So they participated in events for Polish Americans, they talked about their Polish heritage, and for them, being Polish was very much so an important part of their identity, so that would be their ethnic identity. Their Polish identity was so important to them that they went by their hyphenated American name, so they were Polish Americans versus Americans, even though both their kids and their grandkids really only identify as American. So they've dropped the Polish, and that Polish ethnic identity is less important to my parents and my aunts and uncles, as well as me and my cousins. So here I want to know what it means to be an American. So is there an American ethnic identity? If there is, what does it look like? Similarly, what does it mean to be a member of the white race? What does racial identity look like for white people? Class identity is also important to consider in the United States, and for reference, the middle class in the U.S. is considered the normative class. Knowing this, we tend to look down on individuals from lower classes. So take, for example, TV shows like The Maury Show. Maury does DNA tests so he can see who fathered children. He does lie detector tests to see if significant others are cheating on one another. And he's more or less exploiting people who are of the lower class by offering them money or access to needed information. So you can imagine that knowing the paternity for your child would be helpful in securing child support payments. So he he offers individuals of a lower class access to money or needed information and then parades their story on TV, while others, usually individuals of a higher class, look at their misfortune as entertainment. So they can look on those people as trashy or as less than them and reinforce those class identities. One important thing to consider is that most of us will end up being a member of the class to which we were born. So if our parents were middle class, we're likely to be middle class. If our parents were lower class, we're also likely to be lower class. So as much as we might say that hard work and determination can help people move up in the world, that's really difficult to achieve. And there's many people who can't move up those classes no matter how hard they work. Finally, there are some other identities that your book talks about. You should go ahead and read about these, but I'm going to pose a couple questions to you about them right now. So your book talks about physical ability identities, and with this I want you to consider the ways you typically interact with people with disabilities. So in what ways could you work to better acknowledge and reinforce that someone's physical ability identity is a positive rather than a negative identity? Religious identities are also important to consider, and here I want to know, in what ways is your religious identity present in your day-to-day interactions? So is it something you openly wear for other people to see? Why or why not? National identity is also important to consider. So the U.S. is currently in the World Cup. Do you choose to display your national identity differently during this time? Also, if you don't identify as American ethnically, does that affect which teams you root for? Why or why not? Last, with regional identity, how does the region in which you were born, lived, or are living affect your interactions with other people? So what stereotypical behaviors do you engage in because of that regional identity? So for example, the picture says that Midwesterners love ranch dressing. Finally, it's also important to recognize that you can have a personal identity. And again, please make sure you read through what each of these are so that you can make sure you have a firm grasp on those things before moving forward. Okay, so hopefully through this video you've learned that we all have multiple identities that we can choose to display at different times and in different contexts. One final thing to think about would be any times you made the decision to hide an identity because you didn't feel it would be accepted within a particular context or within a particular situation. Why did you make the decision to hide that identity? So what social, political, or historical forces affected your decision?